I'm George Smith, and I'm one of the recipients of the Chemistry Prize in 2018. Well, originally I would say that I had a passion for like nature, especially animals. Apparently, I roped my parents in going to the Bronx Zoo and stood for like half an hour watching alligators and crocodiles that never moved. They needed to have a lot of patience with me. In 1949, when I was 8 years old, we went on a vacation in Maine, in the northeast of the United States, and the place was like alive with snakes. And I caught my first snake, a green snake, and paraded into the living room where my mother was entertaining a tea party of the very sort of like proper ladies of the neighborhood who appropriately screeched and so on. I became very interested in snakes at that point. And in fact, our family lived in Japan during the Korean War from 1952 to 1954, and I and a friend whose name I've long since forgotten were both lovers of snakes, and there were so many wonderful snakes in Japan at the time. So I thought I was going to be a herpetologist when I grew up. And I would have, I think, except that my college, Haverford College, had only 3 biology professors, and all of them were cell and molecular biologists. No one was, anything like a herpetologist. So actually, professionally, I abandoned my herpetology, and I became a molecular biologist. Oh, my parents are relevant in many ways. Scientifically, I would say my father was very influential because he was an army officer. He was in the branch we call ordnance, which is like supplies. It's kind of like the business part of the army. But he was curious about everything. For example, when we lived in Japan, every weekend, he would be taking us on an adventure in the neighborhood, off the army base where we lived, and using sign language and expressions and so on to converse with like a farmer, like peanut farmer or something like that. We'd so many times be invited for tea inside someone's house. He was just extremely outgoing and curious about everything, and especially about. He went to West Point, which is our military academy, and that's kind of like a technical education. It's like an engineering education. And so he was particularly interested in science, engineering, things like that. So I think that was very influential in my upbringing, as far as my science upbringing, and being something that really encouraged that kind of curiosity and interest in how the world works, like how things work. That was one of his big things. He would understand how gadgets worked, and I think I inherited, or not genetically, but I was encouraged to have that kind of habit of mind from my father. So that was certainly a big part. Also, my father was in the army, and as I became politically active or politically aware in the 1960s, the war in Vietnam was a big part, and my parents, despite the fact that they were an army family, turned against the war in Vietnam, and this is a very I think perhaps unusual upbringing in the army, so that had quite a bit of influence on me. If I had to say, the thing that has given me most pleasure over the years is kind of like workmanship in the laboratory. like gel electrophoresis. Actually, my postdoctoral advisor, who was also a Nobel laureate, Oliver Smithies, invented gel electrophoresis. Well, any molecular biologist uses it all the time. So, but to me, designing exactly how you would load the samples in what order, um, trying to design it so that the results would be really striking. That was really important to me. I took such great pleasure in the little tiny triumphs of 2 hours of work. I would say that was really important to me. Of course, it was very exciting when sometimes I might have some insight that I thought was a breakthrough or thought was an aha moment. Those were very exciting too, and those were rare. And the delight in workmanship in the laboratory was a constant pleasure to me, a constant scientific pleasure to me. Well, I think it's very important in many ways. For one thing is mentors help students and early career scientists make their thoughts sharper, more concrete. They can also be a force of conservatism about their science, so they also have to learn from their mentors to not to worship their mentors and not to pay attention, not to think that their mentor's word is gospel. Because sometimes the mentors are going to give them advice that it'd be probably in the long run better to ignore. I think that's something that it's very important for a mentor to get across to an early career scientist, a student, a postdoc, etc. That you should. A scientist needs to be skeptical about everything. That I think is a very important lesson for scientists to learn. They have to be skeptical about everything, not to the point that it immobilizes them, but to a point where everything has to be looked on as provisional. Everything in science has to be looked on as provisional. I think this is a habit of thought that is really important in science. A mentor also, of course, serves as a role model. It would be good to be a mentor that upholds standards of decent behavior and morality and the conduct of science. I mean, that, for example, that you're not, you don't be a role model that's like a cutthroat that cuts down competitors, or that looks on science as fundamentally a competitive enterprise, because I don't think it is. I mean, science flourishes by a community of scientists communicating their ideas with each other. Fundamentally, that's the nourishment of science, and I think that mentors owe it to their proteges to value this above all else in science. So how about me? Am I a good role model? Well, I said that I think that scientists need to foster the attitude of being skeptical about everything, so I think everyone should be skeptical about his or her own behavior. And so I think that maybe I'm a harsh critic of myself, and I don't valorize my own behavior as a role model. I aspire to be a good role model, but no one really reaches his or her aspirations. How I heard the news about the prize? Well, it came at 4:30 in the morning in Columbia, Missouri, where we live. And actually, I have kind of sort of the difficulty sleeping through the night that many old people do have. And so I had come downstairs around 10 after 4, to start the coffee for the morning, and the phone rang, and my wife answered it upstairs in the bedroom, and apparently the call was, well, stand by for a very important call from Stockholm, at which point the line went dead. And then the call came through again. She answered it again, and the same message, and she called downstairs. This is a call from Stockholm. I think you better get it. So I did. That's how I learned about it. When I got this call, I was very surprised. Now, I do want to say that I knew that I was one of the hundreds of people that was on the radar of the chemistry committee. And that's because I was invited to a conference in the 100th year anniversary of the Chemistry Prize in 2001, to a conference in honor of that anniversary. There were just very few participants in the conference, maybe 20 or 30 or something like that. And all of us were invited to the ceremony and to the banquet afterwards. So I kind of know what the ceremony is going to be like, although not from the point of view of an actual laureate. But that also alerted me that it was pretty likely that I was on the radar of the chemistry committee. So it did come as a surprise 17 years later, because I thought the time had long since passed. So it wasn't a bolt out of the blue, but it was a big surprise because I had long since thought that this was the time had passed. To be a prize winner when you're retired, because I retired from my university 3 years ago, and I'm not doing much science anymore. So it is something to look back with pleasure and pride that this award has come. I'm going to say in my lecture that I feel that I'm taking it, I'm accepting the prize as a representative of the science community that I belong to, because many people in this community could equally get this prize. But it certainly is an honor that I look upon with pleasure. Also, I think that my family looks on it with even more pleasure than I do. And I should add that this is the first Nobel Prize for my university, a public university, the University of Missouri. And it is a great honor to my university. So I think all three of those are things that give me pleasure, my own pleasure, and the vicarious pleasure on the part of my family and my university and my science community. In countless ways, the science community is nurtured, it depends for its support on the wider community of society as a whole. It depends crucially, of course, on the schools that educate our children, some of whom will eventually end up as part of the professional scientific community, their teachers. It depends crucially on our colleges and universities, especially the public colleges and universities, including my own university, the University of Missouri, where children get their further education and that support the local science communities, of which I was a member at the University of Missouri for 40 years. These are very important. And also, science, the well-being of science depends critically on public institutions, like in the United States, the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health, which supported my research, and similar institutions in other countries, for example, the Medical Research Council in the UK. Our science communities depends on public institutions supported by the people as a whole for critical financial support and for persuading people as a whole that this is really an important part of our culture and the economy. That's what we absolutely depend on, that kind of broad society support, and university support is part of that. It's a perpetual problem in science education, really in education in general, but specifically in science education, is what do we teach our young people to try to ensure as well as we can that they could be successful in science afterwards. So do we teach them the specific technical skills that we ourselves depended on? That's a question that teachers often have to grapple with. And there are two sides to that. One thing is, I think that students really need to understand specifically and concretely what physical things support our theories about nature. What results? What concrete results are behind what we think of as our knowledge about nature. So the students really should learn about some of the nitty-gritty of experimental science, how we carry out experiments and how we look at the data and how we deal with the fact that inevitably data are messy and it's not so clear-cut as if it were in a textbook. We have to, I think, educate students to be sophisticated about the relationship between physical findings and the interpretations that we give about those physical findings. I think that's really critical. And I think also that students should learn about the fundamental ideas, the fundamental theories, theoretical understanding that underlies the science that they're learning. They need to be educated in the science culture in which they are learning. As I tried to say before, also they need to learn to be skeptical about that culture, that it is not the last word, and nothing in science is the last word about anything. They need to be skeptical about that culture as well. These are all things that I think a teacher has a sacred duty to pass on to help to pass on to students as well as he or she can do it. So I'm often asked about the applications of my work and what their meaning is. And so my co-winner, Greg Winter, went on to use the phage display idea in very imaginative ways, not just him, but of course his whole group and other groups that are similar groups carrying out similar research. Use this in very imaginative ways that have turned out to be important for developing new medicines. And a good example, and a commonly cited example in the context of this prize is Humira, which is a medicine developed partly using phage display technology. Not by me, but that's an example of something that has come from this. I'm not sure that I would say that I myself am most proud of that. To me, phage display, the technology that I developed, I saw it my vision at the time, as it matured over a few years, was that it would make a technologically very productive technology available broadly and cheaply and without a very strong technical background required, without the high demands, technological demands, available widely to researchers all over the world. And that is I think that it is an aspiration that has been partly met, because certainly many people have used phage display in ordinary laboratories, not in heavily funded industry laboratories or academic laboratories, but in very ordinary laboratories, as my laboratory was itself. Doesn't have a lot of money to spare, but this was a technology that could be carried out by such a laboratory. That was a big aspiration of mine. I think it is one that has been partly fulfilled. I mentioned before that I've been retired for 3 years, and I haven't abandoned science altogether. I still go to lab meetings for a couple of collaborators at the university every week or most weeks, and I go to many of the seminars in my former department, which wasn't chemistry, by the way. It was biology. I'm a biologist. So it's not that I've abandoned science altogether. But I also have continued a long-standing interest in my life in, I would say, social justice and human rights. That has, I would say that it started in the 1960s when I was a war resister during the Vietnam War, and has continued on and off since then. So that's become a very important part of my life. Human rights and social justice. In the United States, for example, a major effort that my wife Margie Sable and I are involved in is the fight for a just healthcare system in our country, one that is universally available to all citizens, and that does not bankrupt people that happen to get sick. So that would be an iconic social justice issue, and that kind of issue is what engages me more now in my retirement life.
Fantastic. One final question, which we're putting to all the laureates. You have talked.
Well, it would be funny to me, except that I've known many Nobel laureates, and I know about many of the prizes. I told you that I was at the ceremony in 2001. There was no Nobel Prize in biology. Yet clearly biology is an iconic scientific enterprise, and especially in ever since Darwin, really. But it is a landmark scientific enterprise in the 20th century, right from the beginning of the 20th century, when Darwin was fully accepted by the biological community. And since chemistry is deeply involved in biology, it is pretty natural that many of the prizes in chemistry that involve biological subjects are awarded to people who would identify themselves as biologists. And also that really applies to physics as well, because several of the physics prizes, I think, owe their salience to the fact that they have led to applications in biological sciences. So yes, I think that I think that it's pretty natural that prizes go to biologists from both chemistry, especially chemistry, but also physics, to not just to make up, but for the fact that there's no biology prize. And also, Barbara McClintock, who was a Mays geneticist, got the prize in physiology and medicine, and who could be more of a biologist than Barbara McClintock? So the prize don't fall into the neat categories that Nobel envisioned in his will. And I would imagine that Alfred Nobel would be very pleased that that's the case. A phage is a virus that infects bacteria and grows to huge numbers and can be grown to huge numbers very cheaply. So it is a very convenient laboratory organism for experimenters to work with. So phage display tries to harness this natural device for searching through huge libraries of structures, tens of billions of structures, for structures that have a particular activity that the experimenter wants for some experimental end. As, for example, some structure that would bind to a receptor involved in cancer or autoimmune disease or something like that, and that might be used as an intervention for that disease. So it's a technologically pretty simple and yet powerful way of searching through enormous collections of structures for very rare structures that have a desired activity.